So for lesson three, we're going to be looking at how and why is it important for protecting biodiversity? What laws, what regulations? So the everyday phenomenon to connect us back is how can we protect and preserve biodiversity? We're going to explain the legal actions nations can take to protect biodiversity, explain the goal of species survival plans, and also describe three strategies for managing the whole ecosystem as well as habitat. Today, more and more scientists and citizens see a need to do something about the loss of biodiversity. In his 1994 autobiography, naturalist Owen E. Wilson writes, when the 20th century began, people still thought the planet as infinite in bounty. The highest mountains were still unclimbed, the ocean depths were visited, and vast wilderness stretched across the equatorial continent. But since then, extinction rates have increased, and what was once seemingly endless wilderness is now threatened. So Wilson writes, troubled by what we have wrought, we have to begin to turn in our role from local conqueror to global steward. And is Wilson right? Are we changing roles from conqueror to steward? And are we doing enough to protect remaining biodiversity? So biodiversity can be protected by law. In the United States, the major law that protects biodiversity is the Species Act, or the ECA. It forbids governments and private citizens from harming listed endangered and threatened species. So if they are listed on the list, they are forbidden from being damaged in any way. We also are not able to harm their habitat. So if they live in a particular area, if an endangered species live there, we just can't come in and put houses or something like that. It also forbids the trade in produces made from uh, species that are on the list. So you can't make something and sell that as your own. In other words, you can't kill something and make, I don't know, or sell the bones or something like that. It also requires the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to maintain the official list. In other words, we can make adjustments as the science change. So again, the Endangered Species Act is what's responsible for kind of protecting all these things. And the goal of the Endangered Species Act is to prevent extinction by protecting at-risk species. And again, we're protecting them from natural or artificial harm. So these things could be stuff like pollution, all right, obviously polluting a waterway, predation, disease, and even habitat destruction. So the Endangered Species Act is kind of an encompassing thing. It could stop people from polluting an area. It can stop things from eating a particular species, disease, and trying to cure a disease for that, habitat destruction. All those are protected under this law. So there are some benefits and costs to the ESA, or the Endangered Species Act. So roughly 40% of once declining populations in the United States are now stable. Now that is one of the big benefits that we have. So again, The peregrine falcon, which is one on the left, owes its recovery to careful management under the ESA. And the ESA protection for the northern spotted owl, the one on the right, is caused some controversy in the Pacific Northwest when loggers lost their jobs because we couldn't cut down the forest. We were protecting their habitat. So there's some good in the bad. We're saving species, but also there could be some economic decisions that could be impacted by animals that are endangered. Now, in 1997, the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora was formed, called CITES. Now, this is a treaty. It's an agreement under national law, meaning this encompasses the whole world, whoever signed this treaty. So what CITES does is it protects endangered species, obviously like the ESA, by banning international transport. So, for example, some of the organisms that are on this list are actually able to be hunted in the United States, like cats are actually put under the CITES treaty. So, in other words, if I would harvest a bobcat, maybe I do some trapping or something like that, I would need a CITES tag in order to move that across state lines as well as federal lines. So this can protect tigers as well as other bird species from kind of being sold outside of the country. Now, in the 1992, leaders of many nations met in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and agreed to the conservation of biological diversity, sometimes called the Biodiversity Treaty. Now, the treaty has three main goals. First of all, they want to conserve biodiversity. And this is biodiversity not just in particular countries, but globally. And they also want to use biodiversity in a sustainable manner. In other words, they're not just banning all sorts of things, but they want to set up a plan that makes the use of our resources sustainable. And they also want to ensure the fair distribution of biodiversity benefits. In other words, some areas are going to have more biodiversity and more benefits. What is an effective way of sharing these resources across countries? Now, a couple things we want to look at and what you were going to reflect on your own. And again, this connects back to the investigative phenomenon. Why is it important to measure and protect biodiversity? So take a second here and form an opinion on the importance of international cooperation in the protection of biodiversity, and write a statement summarizing their opinion based on information from what we just learned. So pause the video, take a minute, and write a statement of why it's important for international cooperation. Now, the next thing we want to look at is the United States has signed the treaty but has not ratified it, meaning the treaty is not yet enforced in the United States law. So let's kind of think about this a little more. So that treaty we just talked about, the Biodiversity Treaty. Do you think the United States should ratify the Biodiversity Treaty? Write a letter to your state or federal legislature explaining why you think it is or is not important that the United States enforces the regulations of the treaty. So I don't need you to write a letter. I just want you to reflect on this. Why do you think it should be important that the United States ratifies this treaty or doesn't ratify the treaty? And what are some reasons for your thinking? So pause the video and write a reflection on the make a difference. Now, in conserving biodiversity, sometimes we have a single species approach. So conservation biologists use field data, lab data, theories and experiment to study the effects of people on other organisms. When protecting biodiversity, conservation programs can target specific single species or can try to protect whole habitats and ecosystems. So again, it could be a very wide range that we have. Now, one of the single species type things is the captive breeding program. So in the effort to save threatened and endangered species, zoos and botanical gardens have become centers for captive breeding. So captive breeding is the process of breeding and raising organisms in a controlled condition. So again, we are breeding and then raising these organisms in a controlled condition. Again, we are making sure everything is okay. Now, in modern zoos and aquariums, captive breeding is part of an overall program to protect the species that we call species survival, or we abbreviate it as SSP. So again, when we're looking at this, we want to look at how are we affecting endangered species? We're not just breeding them in the zoo to keep them in the zoo, but trying to reintroduce them back into the environment. Now, the newest idea for saving species from extinction is to make more individuals through cloning. Now, in this technique, we take DNA from endangered species. And this is inserted into a cultured egg. Okay, and again, this egg has their nucleus removed, and what we're doing is we're putting the DNA into a new one. Now, the egg is then implanted into a close relative, so a closely related species. So, for example, if I'm trying to bring back the woolly mammoth, I would insert this egg into an elephant. Okay, very close species, DNA is very similar, that it can act as a surrogate mother. Now, cloning won't help prevent biodiversity loss without ample habitat. So if you don't have the habitat to put these back in, as well as the protection of the species in the wild, nothing is going to change. So you may have seen the news recently where they had brought back dire wolves. Now, again, in order to reintroduce the dire wolves, they need to have their habitat available for them. So again, it's something that you need not only the species, but also places for them to live. So most laws, including the Endangered Species Act, do not specifically provide protection for whole habitats and ecosystems, only individual species. However, many conservation biologists recognize the need to move beyond single species approach and protect not only the species, but the habitats and the ecosystems in which they live. So this kind of brings us to biodiversity hotspots, one effort oriented around geographic regions rather than a single species. Is the mapping of these biodiversity hotspots. Where is biodiversity the highest? So biodiversity hotspot is an area that both supports an especially high number of endemic species. And is rapidly losing biodiversity. Okay, so again, where we have species which we call endemic. Now, what does this word endemic species mean? An endemic species is um, is to an area if it's found nowhere else. So something is endemic if it's found nowhere else on planet Earth. So when we're protecting hotspots, we're looking for these endemic species that are living in a particular habitat. So to qualify as a hotspot, a location must harbor at least 1,500 endemic plant species or 0.5% of the world total. And they also must have already lost 70% of its habitat because of human actions and be in danger of losing more. So again, we have a lot of hotspots around the world that we have classified. So the non-profit group Conservation International maintains a list of 36 biodiversity hotspots, once covering 16.7% of the planet's land surface, but today only covers about 2.4%. So you can see that habitat is disappearing. Now these areas are home to 50% of the world's plant species and 43% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. Now, to help conservation biologists focus on these areas where the greatest number of unique species can be protected with the least amount of effort. So you can see we have a lot of biodiversity hotspots throughout the world. So some areas of the world possess these exceptionally high numbers of species found nowhere else, and many conservation biologists have supported prioritizing these areas, called these biodiversity hotspots shown in red. Now, in the United States, we have the pine oak woodlands, we have the California floristic province, the North America coastal plain. Again, these areas have a significantly high number of species, both on land and in the water. Now, there has to be some sort of economic approach in order to make this viable. So one of those economic approaches is the debt for nature swap. Conservation organization raises money and offers to pay off a portion of developing nationals' internal debt. And in exchange, we are looking for a promise by the nation to set aside reserves, funds, or to fund environmental education and to better manage protected areas. All right. So now, the other thing we can do for an economic approach is a conservation concession. Now, governments often sell concessions or rights to corporations, allowing them to extract resources. Now, a conservation international has started paying countries for the right to conserve its resources, not to extract them. So in other words, we're paying them to kind of keep their lands intact to prevent any more loss of biodiversity. Now, another thing we can do is what's known as a wildlife corridor. Now, this is a big one out in the western United States. So recall that population sizes often decline when habitat is fragmented. One way to increase fragment size is to establish these wildlife corridors. And what these corridors do is that they connect fragmented habitats. By connecting habitats, we then allow them to roam more freely. which then gives them their more resources to survive. Now, the major benefit is they enable once isolated populations of organisms to interbreed. And again, what this does is it increases genetic diversity, which makes the population a lot more stable. So one of these wildlife corridors you can see here in Australia, state patches. State passage. The southern causeway to the left there is a large flightless bird closely related to the emu and ostrich. Only 1,200 or 1,500 individuals remain in Australia. Now, conservation biologists hope that when completed, the corridor to the right will enable isolated cassowary population to interbreed. So volunteers are planting trees that will be part of this corridor. So you can see we try to connect all of these fragmented habitats so that those populations then become connected. All right. So this is the end here of lesson 3. Make sure that you are answering your end of lesson questions at the end of 7.3. All right. So this would be the end of the chapter. So we'd also be looking for a test coming up soon. Hopefully this helps you out on some biodiversity issues.